Hi everyone, Heather Wu here of Closet Core Patterns and Crew, obviously. Coming to you with this month's tutorial video for the Marigold sweater that we released in February 2023. In this video, we're gonna cover some really basic pattern making skills that are going to allow you to transform Marigold into either like a tighter fitting sweater dress or a looser fitting kind of boxier knit dress or sweater, depending on where you go. And as you can see right now, I'm wearing Marigold. I think this is view A. It's got the fabric band through the waist. This one is made with a stretch fleece. It's super comfy and cozy. And what Véronik did, our production manager, and the reason we kind of got this idea to begin with, was she went and took Marigold and she converted it into the sweatshirt dress. And when she brought it in, we were all completely obsessed. And I was like, okay, I want to teach everybody in Crew how to do this themselves. So basically what she did, and what I'm going to show you how to do, is she converted the bound neckline, which you can see here. So we had this, the bound neckline is where we wrap the fabric around the neckline. She swapped that out for a traditional kind of knit band, like a t-shirt neckline, which she did with a bit of stretch ribbing. She did a bunch of cover stitching. So this looks, I don't know if you can see because it's black, but she did that kind of sweatshirt detail where you put the V at the neckline. She cover stitched all this in place. She, instead of doing the elastic gathered sleeve with, again, the bound edge, she came in with a ribbed cuff here. And then she extended the length of this and added in some width for her hips and made this really awesome, super cozy sweatshirt dress, which I immediately copied. And I'm going to show you how to copy it as well. So this is there's a little bit of basic pattern making we're going to cover here. And then there's another version I want to show you. So this is fairly close fitting through the hip. I also want to show you a version where we're going to give you much more ease through the hip. We're going to create much more of a kind of boxier, loose, fluid shape, which is beautiful. I have a sample I can show you in a few minutes. And it just gives you a completely different look. And what excites us about Marigold, and I think a lot of patterns, when you learn how to do a little bit of pattern modification, is that if you have a pattern where you either maybe like the fit or you like a detail or there's something that you like about it, we want to encourage you to think about creative ways that you can then take that base pattern and then make multiple different garments, right? Obviously, it's going to save you money, but if you have something that you already really like, it's going to save you that even the time and the energy of going to make something where the final result isn't something that you love. So there's an adage we like to use in the studio, which is you can give a person a fish and they're going to eat for a day, or you can teach them to fish and they are going to eat for the rest of their lives. And so I really think about pattern making skills is we're hopefully letting you eat for the rest of your life. I think it's really, really important, especially as you get into sewing, no matter where you are on your journey, that you have a few basic pattern making skills under your belt so you can make the clothes that you want, so you can modify patterns. Yes, obviously, these are also going to help with things like fitting. So I think it's going to be very helpful for you regardless of where you are. If you've never done any pattern adjustments right now, I think you're gonna learn some basics. And if you have, hopefully this will at least save you some time of having to figure out how to make these modifications on your own, because I'm gonna show you how to do them on camera. So before we get started, let's just talk about some of the things that you're gonna need in order to modify your pattern. So the first one is a quilting ruler. And I think if you are trying to stock your sewing space, you really should have a quilting ruler in your collection of supplies. You're always needing to make straight lines, and you're always needing to refer, if you have a grain line and you're trying to draw, a horizontal line in reference to that, the quilting line or the quilting ruler is going to give you that reference line. So this helps you create really accurate perpendicular lines, essentially. We use it all the time. The other thing that you should have is a French curve. Now, if you're maybe an artist or a really good drawer, you can definitely try freehanding curves, but we love a French curve because if you're not a great drawer, or you're a little shaky or whatever, or if you have a curve that you need to repeat over and over again, you have this nice straight edge to copy from. And a French curve is essentially just something that has various degrees of curve. So here we can see it's pretty gentle. Then if I turn it, it starts getting a little bit sharper. Here it's starting to get really curved. And so you can draw a variety of curved lines just using this one tool. This is just a pretty cheap floppy one, probably under 10 bucks. So definitely suggest having a French curve. The other thing that I love, and we'll put a link for it in the video description, is a seam allowance curve. So this is a woman on Etsy. We love her. She's great. She has all these cool kind of sewing rulers and sewing tools. And what this does, because with closet core patterns, we don't mark the seam line, the stitching line, I should say, the seam allowance on the pattern. We just have the cut line for you. But there are lots of times where you need to go in and draw that seam allowance. So you could take a ruler and kind of if it's 5/8, draw 5/8 all the way around a curve and then go and connect them all. But this, just like that French curve, has all these different curves, and it has a 1/4 inch, 1/8 of an inch, all the way up to 5/8 of an inch marked on here. So I can go and mark my seam allowances super easily without needing like a little tiny ruler to measure everything. So I'll show how this works on camera, but I find this super helpful. So if you want to invest in one of these, it's definitely well worth it. The other thing you're going to need is measuring tape, a piece of narrow elastic. So we're going to use this to find some reference points on our body. So 1/4 inch elastic is great. And then you're going to want some tape, some extra paper, some pencils. Whenever I'm doing any pattern work, I always like to have 2 colors. So maybe like a colored pencil to kind of draw in my initial lines, and then I go in over it with a regular pencil once I'm sure where I want that line to be. So that's basically all we need today. And like I said, we're going to talk about making 2 different looks, of kind of a slimmer fitting sweatshirt dress and then a slightly looser fitting dress. So let's go over to our pattern pieces and we can start talking about what we're going to need to do in order to make this happen. The main modifications we're going to be making in this pattern making tutorial is the front and the back. So right now you can see the back here. And because Marigold is fairly short, I think we have a waist mark here. And you can assume that your hip is going to fall somewhere down here. So what we need to do is figure out how much space we need with the hip. And we're going to actually come in here and draw in our hip curve. So in order to figure out how much room we need through the hip, we have to take a variety of different measurements. And I'm going to walk you through which ones we need. We need our waist measurement, of course. We need our hip measurement. And then we need to figure out the distance between our neck to our waist and then from our neck to our hip. And once we have those length dimensions, that will let us on the pattern know where we need to come in and add the width that we're going to need through the hip. So I'm sure you all know how to take your own measurements, but let's just go through this again. With our waist, we're going to take, for some people, you're going to take it at your natural waist. So that's going to be where your waist kind of comes in. For some people, if you're a little bit more square through the torso and you don't have that kind of natural line where you can mark your waist, you can just decide where your waist is. So you can kind of look visually on your body and say, you know, this is where I would like my waist to be. So wherever you would like that to mark that waist, you're going to want to go and take that measurement. So I just did mine. I'm about 35 inches in the waist right now. And then you're going to go and take your hip measurement. And through the hip, it's just important that you get through, you take that measurement at the widest part of your hip. Okay, so we know how much width that we need in this dress. It's really important that you're taking it at the widest point. So if I come here through here, my hip measurement was about 44.5 inches. So I'm just going to go and mark that down, that I have a 35-inch waist and then my hip's about 44.5. And now we need to figure out the length measurements. So I'm going to take that bit of elastic and I'm going to come through my waist. I'm just going to tie it. Right, so sitting at my natural waist, again, you just determine where you want your waist, where you're defining that waist to be. And now I'm going to come through with my measuring tape and I'm going to measure basically from, I'll do it on the side so I don't mess up my microphone, basically where my seam, I'm assuming my shoulder seam is going to be. So it's kind of like centered on my shoulder. I'm actually wearing Marigold right now, so I know exactly where I need to take it. And I'm going to take it right at the nape of my neck, so right where the neck starts to curve, because that's where the neckline is going to sit. So I'm going to take that tape, and then I'm going to measure kind of straight down. I know you might be tempted if you have a larger bust to measure all the way around your bust. Try to kind of do it in one straight line, and I'll show you why in a moment. So I'm going to measure down to here. And it's about 17 inches from the nape of my neck to the waist. Now I'm going to do this. I'm going to write that down, 17 inches. Now I'm going to take that same line. I'm going to take that elastic. I'm going to move it down to my hips, to the widest part of my hips. So that's going to give me, So here, I'm just looking in the camera. Here's about the widest part of my hips. Does that look right, Anna?
That's right. Maybe just a touch higher?
A little higher, right there?
Yeah.
Okay. So now, I'm gonna come in with my tape. I'm gonna take the same measurement, trying to just kind of get a straight shot down. And it's about 26 inches. So now I know what my waist is, I know what my hip is, and I know how far it's going to be from my neck to my waist, and then my neck to my hip. Okay, so once you've got all that done, you want to have your pattern printed out, obviously, and you're going to want some spare paper because we're going to, especially if you're on a copy shop, we need to actually draw in a dress, right? So we don't have enough paper, so you're going to want to have some spare paper. So once you have those measurements, now you need to decide what kind of fit you want. So because Marigold is a knit, it means that you can have some negative ease through your hips if you want it to fit really tightly. And what we mean by negative ease is if zero ease means that if your hip is 45 inches, the pattern through the hip is going to be 45 inches. If it has negative ease, let's say it has 2 inches of negative ease, if your hips are 45, the pattern through the hip is going to be 43 inches. Now, let's say you want positive ease. You don't want it tight through the body. You want it loose through the body. In both of the cases that we're going to do today, I'm going to do one dress with negative 2 inches of ease and one with positive 2 inches of ease. And I'm going to show you how to do both. But before you start pattern making, you should kind of decide what you're looking for. So you could also do zero ease with the knit. And you can really only do negative ease with knits, obviously, because they have stretch. If you tried to do negative ease with a woven that doesn't have a lot of stretch, you're not going to fit into them. So I would say if you wanted to make something that's like a little bit tighter and maybe a little bit more body conscious, bodycon as they call it, you would go with a little bit of negative ease. And I would say 1 to 3 inches or 1 to 4 inches, maybe at the very upper end, you would want to do. And I would say if you have like a larger hip measurement, so if you're, let's say like 50 to 60, proportionately, you might want a little bit less negative. You might want more negative ease. So maybe you could get away with doing 3 or 4 inches of negative ease. If you have a smaller hip measurement and you do that much, proportionately, it's going to feel quite tight. So like I said, you're going to see what this looks like on me. I'm going to put the dress on so you understand what 2 inches of negative ease looks like and then what 2 inches of positive ease looks like. So once you have that figured out, then we can get down to drafting. Okay, so I have gone ahead and I've printed the size 14 on a piece of paper. Based on my measurements, I'm probably actually closer to a 16, but it is what it is. It's gonna not affect my ability to show you how to do this. And as you can see, I've just gone ahead and I've taped some extra paper at the bottom here because we need more space to draw in our hip measurement. So the first thing that we need to do, oh no, I should also say I'm showing you the front piece, but you're gonna basically do the exact same thing to the back. You might actually be able to just trace all of these changes to your back piece rather than doing it all over again at the same time, because the front and back are really similar. You know, they're slightly different through the arm and they're slightly different through the neckline, but we'll get to that in a moment. But I'm just basically gonna show you the main modifications that we're gonna make right on the front of the size 14. So the first thing that we want to do, because we had taken that measurement at the nape of our neck, as you'll remember, and we can't go and just measure straight down from this line because this is the cut line of the fabric. We actually have to measure from the seam allowance. So I'm going to take that seam allowance ruler I showed you. And remember, because it's a knit, all closet core knit patterns switch. Most of our patterns have a 5/8 seam allowance, but when we're dealing with a knit, we have 3/8. So I'm just going to come in, and as I had explained, you can actually see, I don't know if you can see, I'll get hopefully on this paper, that the seam allowance is marked. I can come in here and actually use it to mark my 3/8 seam, so I'm not eyeballing it. And then because there's a little bit of a curve here, I can actually come in and draw those seam allowances as curves if I needed to, just to show you how this works, why it's so cool. I'm gonna do the same thing on my neckline. So again, because it's curved, I can kind of come in here and mark up at that 3/8, and then it's really easy to mark my 3/8 seam allowance. Really the important one that we want to measure is this one from the shoulder seam. So remember when I went and I took the length measurement from the nape of my neck to my waist, the length of that was 17 inches. So now that I have a reference point here, I'm going to come in with my quilting ruler and I'm going to measure 17 inches down. And I want to make sure that I'm measuring straight down, and I'm respecting the grain line. So let's actually line up here with our grain line here so I can make sure that I'm drawing a parallel line. I'm not drawing a weird angled line. And here I am. Okay, everything's nice and straight. And I'm going to go ahead and mark, oops, upside down. Let's try this again. Okay, I'm going to come down here. So it's 17 inches. So I'm going to mark this here. So this is actually my waist. I'm just going to mark this here. This is waist. And then you'll remember that from the nape of my neck down to my hip was 26 inches. So I'm actually going to need a measuring tape here because my quilting ruler isn't that long, but I'll use that straight edge as a guide. So I'm going to come down here and measure 26 inches. Oh. There we go. So 26 is here. I'll just put a little H there for hip. So now I know where, right here, now I know where I need to add width for my hip. So now what I want to do is extend. So this is the center front seam, and this seam is cut on the fold. So I'm just going to use my quilting ruler to come in and extend this line all, quite a bit down. Oops, that wasn't the nicest line. Let's try that again. Oop. Okay, so this is my new center front. I'm just extending this line. And now that I have a nice straight line and I know where my hip line is, I'm going to come in, I'm going to use my quilting ruler to find the perpendicular line, using center front as a guide. And I'm going to come in and I'm going to draw my hip line. So this is my hip reference line. You know what that hip measurement is? And now we have to translate that hip measurement to the pattern piece. So just think about this sweater, okay? We've got one piece this way, and then we have the same piece in the back. But the pattern piece itself, there's a seam line here, or sorry, the center front line is here. So what we want to do in order to figure out how wide our hip is we're going to take our hip measurement, which is 44.5. We're going to divide it by 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, which gives us 11.125. So let's say like 11 and an eighth of an inch. So now I'm going to come back to my pattern and I'm going to draw in that 11 and 1/8 of an inch, okay? Here, I'm using my quilting ruler again, and I'm going to measure at 11 and an eighth right here. So now this is how wide my hip is from here to here. And now I need to decide how much ease I want. So remember, I said if you wanted a closer fitting bodycon dress, you're going to want about 2 inches of negative ease. So 2 inches of negative ease divided by 4 is 1/2 of an inch. So if I remove 1/2 of an inch from that 11.25 I just marked, that, when I multiply this from this measurement to here and I measure that 4 times, it's going to give me my hip measurement minus the 2 inches of negative ease. Hopefully that makes sense. So now I know what my hip line needs to look like. And I want to remind you that this line is without a seam allowance. So just now, because what we're going to do is we're going to come in through here and we're going to actually draw our hip curve. So in order to do that, we have to know where the seam allowance is. So I'm going to come in through here. And once again, I'm just going to use my seam allowance ruler to measure, use this side here, to get in that 3/8 of an inch. And if you don't have the seam allowance ruler, and probably most of you don't, oh, sorry, measuring 1/4 of an inch by mistake. Just go in and measure 3/8 here. If you don't have a ruler like this, and you want to measure that seam allowance, the easiest way I found to do it is to either take a measuring tape or a little short ruler, and you're just going to come in and mark your 3/8 of an inch this way. So you would maybe have to do it multiple times. Like you'd have to mark it here and here and here and here and here and all the way down, and then connect it with your pencil. Obviously, when you're using the seam allowance ruler, you don't need to do that. You can kind of just draw it as you're going. So now what we want to do is, we know that this is the hip point that we want to connect, and we need to connect it to here. So how do we do that? If it is going to help, if it's gonna help you kind of visualize what this looks like, I would suggest going, if you have a pattern in your stash that is a one-piece dress that has a waist, that goes from bust to waist to hip in one piece, you might wanna go look at that. Maybe you wanna even trace that line as a reference line. I think it's helpful to kind of figure this out on your own, but if you need to visualize what that looks like, you're welcome to do that. What we don't wanna do, because we want a bodycon dress, is we don't wanna take the seam allowance and then just go and draw a straight line from here to here. That's gonna look very weird. It's gonna create a weird triangular shape, and then what are you supposed to do with it once you're at the hip line, right? Do you just continue it in a straight line? I guess you could if you wanted to do like a really loose A-line shape, but that's not what we wanna do. We wanna create something that's kind of fitted. As we said, our waist measurement is around here, and I marked where my waist is. We also have as we were drafting, marked the waistline on the actual pattern. So it's interesting to see where my waist is in relation to our drafting. It's about about a half an inch higher. But I want it to fit somewhat slimly through the waist, and then I just want to come in and add a little bit of room so that I have room through the hip. So what I like to do when I'm drawing that hip line is I start there, and I'm just going to come in. First of all, the other, thing we want to decide is how we want it to fit through the rest of the body. And I would say once I have my hip measurement, I pretty much want it to just come straight down. You could you could decide you wanted to add a little bit of flare, but for me, I want to have a pretty straight pencil skirt vibe all the way down. So I'm going to use my quilting ruler once again. I'm going to come and use my horizontal hip line as a reference, and I'm just going to draw a straight line down from that hip, okay? So that's basically the skirt is going to come down straight like this. And now I need to connect this line to the waist. And so I'm going to use my French curve, and I'm going to just try to find a combination of curves that is going to give me the nice, smooth, curved line that I want. And so sometimes you just kind of have to play with it. Sorry, I should be doing this the other way. Because what we're doing is we're curving out. You're curving out, and then you're kind of curving back in. So you're going from a kind of convex curve to sort of a concave one. So I'm just going to come in with a convex side, and I'm just going to start adding a little bit of width here. And then I'll turn it around so it's concave, and I'll find a nice line. Like, where does it feel nice to draw in that hip? And think about your hip shape too, right? Like if you have a really high hip, some people's, maybe the widest part of your hip is here, but maybe it stays like this and it doesn't start narrowing until further up. So you could decide to do that, but I kind of know my hip kind of happens like this. So I'm just gonna come in here. This feels good to me. And now I'm gonna connect that hip shape to the waist shape. So I'll just draw this in a little bit bolder with basically what I want to happen. And if that doesn't look smooth, you can always kind of come in. Let me do it with my pencil. Always just kind of come in here and smooth it out. Okay, and now I have this hip. I have enough room now for my hip. Of course, now what I would need to do is come in and draw my seam allowance again, right? So I'm going to come in and I'm going to draw that 3/8 seam. And then I'm going to basically have to do the same thing where I come in and connect it to the seam allowance. So now I know where my cut line is. And then I'm going to come back, draw in the rest of my seam allowance. And then I have to determine how long I want my dress. So I think in my case, the dress I'm about to show you, I did it a bit longer. I did the entire length was 46 inches. So it was 46 inches from here all the way down to the hem. So wherever you decide you want that to end, you're just going to go and draw your horizontal line here, and that's going to become basically the hem of your dress. So this is what it's going to look like if you want something that's a little bit more form-fitting, and you can see here it's really following, because it's closer fitting, it's really following the curves of the body, and your hip curve might look a little bit different. But what happens if I want to do something really loose fitting? So just to help you visualize this, I'm actually going to put both of these on so you can kind of understand the difference between what 2 inches of negative ease looks like and what 4 inches of negative ease looks like. And if you'll just give me a minute, I'm going to step off camera and do this. Of course, just give me 1 second. So here is the sweater dress that I made. Again, I made this in a really stretchy stretch fleece that we have in stock at Core Fabrics. if you're going to do anything with negative ease, you want to make sure that you have lots of stretch in the fabric. So if it's like 100% cotton fleece and there's no stretch in it, you might not get enough stretch to do 2 inches of negative ease. You're going to want to have a fair amount of stretch through your fabric. The other thing you're going to want to make sure is that this fabric has 4-way stretch. So it didn't really matter what direction we cut it in. But in the instructions for Marigold, it's a little bit unconventional because, you know, most tops or sweaters or whatever, you're going to sew the grain line. The center front line is going to end up being perpendicular. Sorry, not perpendicular. The center front line will be parallel to the selvage line. In this case, we actually rotated the pieces. So the top, the neckline, instead of it being here, it's actually here, and the hem is here, if this is a selvage and this is a selvage. And we did that because in knits, it really created this pretty drape, like the drape was nicer for us to rotate it. But if you have a fabric that is only 2-way stretch, and most 2-way stretch fabrics are only going selvage to selvage, you might not, now the stretch is running this way, it's not running this way through the body. You might actually have to rotate your pieces so that you have the stretch that you need going through your hip, okay? So if the stretch is running selvage to selvage, you wanna make sure that your dress is running parallel to that selvage line so that you have enough stretch through the hip. And it might just affect a little bit the drape through the bodice, but not so much that it's gonna make a difference. So that's just one thing to keep track of is it a 4-way stretch? Is it a fabric that I might have to rotate my pattern pieces in order that I have enough stretch through the body? So once again, this is that sweatshirt dress I made. It's not completely finished, it's not hemmed. And then I did another version with 2 inches of positive ease in this really beautiful but weird wool knit. And I'm gonna show you how different this looks from one to the other. Here I am, I'm just gonna throwing on quickly the sweatshirt dress that I made, wearing it over my jeans. But this has a couple inches of negative ease. And you can see it's quite slim through the, like there's less fabric through the hips than I actually have in my body. So it's nice and tight through the hips, as you can see. And it's super cozy and comfy and has a really nice drape, okay? But you can see it's quite slim fitting through the hip. Now I'm gonna go throw on the other one I made that has positive ease, and you can see the difference it's gonna make by adding or subtracting that fabric. So I've just gone and thrown on this other one I made. So this is in this like 100% wool knit fabric that we were just carrying in Core Fabrics. And we thought it was gonna be like a little bit thinner, but it's quite thick, like it's almost like a coating, but it does have stretch in it. And I was making this last week, and I just tried it on at this point to see how I was gonna finish everything. And like, I kind of like all of the seams raw like this. Like I'm considering honestly just wearing it like this because it's wool. It's almost like a boiled texture. It's not gonna unravel. So if you have like a really thick knit, you could maybe just skip finishing it. Like I actually am kind of into the sleeves like this without having a band on it. It's up to you. But I just wanna show you, by adding more ease through the hip, like it's a completely different look. Like it feels very kind of sculptural and fashion to me. I think over a pair of leggings or something, it could be really cool. If you did it a little bit longer, it just becomes this very cool silhouette. So just to kind of get a sense of just by adding or subtracting ease through the hip, you get completely different shapes through the body. So I already showed you how to do a dress that's stretchy, that is using negative ease. So I'm just gonna show you how you would draft to get a shape like this. One more thing I wanna talk to you about this silhouette. So you can see it's pretty straight, it's almost like a right angle between here and here. If I wanted a little less volume through the underarm, I could maybe shape this more. This is to show you, there's so many different ways that you can modify patterns. I think a lot of the time people feel like it's magic and get really kind of locked in and like are scared of making pattern adjustments because they think it's gonna mess it up. Something like this, it's a knit, it's 2 pieces, like go wild, try, experiment with some different techniques and see what works. So I'm gonna show you how to do this kind of right angle. But if I go back to the camera, I'm going to show you some other ways that you could think about joining those lines. So here's the pattern that I use to cut out my dress. And you can see there's all these different curved lines. I was trying to figure out in my head, maybe I wanted to add less ease through the waist and come in and then have more ease through the hips. And I think any one of these would have worked. What I ended up doing was deciding, you know what, I'm gonna do this kind of boxier shape. And if I don't like it, I can always come back in after I've assembled it for the first time and then take it in further if I wanna shape those seams. So I ended up doing this pretty right angle, which I'm gonna show you right now. So again, here's that line we marked. This is gonna be our new hip line. And again, I wanna take this line pretty much all the way down to the hem. So once again, using that hip line as a balance line, I'm gonna connect here. I'm gonna go all the way down. And I'm gonna take that line up now because I wanna do a pretty straight right angle from the sleeve. I'm gonna take it all the way up. And you'll remember, I just need to extend the seam allowance line here so I know where my seam allowance is. Okay, here we go. And so now, and actually maybe I should come back in here and add my outer seam allowance as well so I can see everything all together. Here we go. Just gonna extend this. So here I'm just adding, once again, I'm just adding in that 1/3 of an inch of a seam allowance. Got it all the way down. So now what I want to do is basically copy that little curve here, right here. So I'm going to take this seam allowance ruler because it's got a nice sharp curve right here. And I can kind of, ooh, if I get it right here on the corner, I can kind of replicate it. So I'm just going to take my seam allowance ruler. See if I can get that nice tight curve. There we go. Of course, you can also eyeball that. That's not a hard thing to do. I'm just going to draw it in. So now this becomes my new cut line. And if I extend that all the way down to the hem, that's going to give me that boxy shape. To conclude, I want you to just take a look at this globally. Here was the original pattern. Here's where we came in and added that hip curve with a little bit of negative ease, so it's fitting slimly through, like pretty closely through the body. And then here is what it looks like if you're doing a little bit of a boxier shape and you're giving yourself more ease through the waist and body. And again, this curve, you could have, you know, lots of ease here. You could also come in here and add a little bit of curve if you wanted to, but you can do that later while you're sewing the garment. So those are the two major pattern modifications we're going to be making here. And you could cut this all out once you know what your final hem length is and go put it on your back piece and basically copy the exact same line onto that back pattern piece. And once again, here I am in that sweater. So if I wanted to come in, I've got lots of fabric to play with here. I could come in and I could try scooping it out, maybe with a basting line if I'm not ready to completely commit. I can really come in and shape this until we get it to a fit that we like. But honestly, like, I love this. I think Alma and I were just talking about it, and I think I'm gonna finish everything with a facing so I can keep the length of the sleeve. I'm just gonna do a big wide facing here and maybe a facing on the neckline because this is a pretty sturdy fabric. It's much sturdier than a regular knit, so I could actually do a facing. And I might just leave the hem raw like this because I think it looks really cute. So that is how you take the Marigold sweater and you can make a sweatshirt dress out of it. You can make a looser fitting boxy top. And of course, length is all up to you. You could go and take that hem all the way to the floor. You could make a really cozy sweatshirty nightgown, maxi. You could make a mid calf kind of T-length, midi length. You could take it below the knee, above the knee. Of course, you could also just come and crop it down here so you have something like a tunic that just covers your butt, something to wear with leggings. Lots and lots of potential. And again, pretty simple pattern modifications for those two, for the front and the back. And the last thing I want to talk to you about is if you do make it a sweatshirt dress where we have that knit band and we have the cuff, the pattern modifications you're going to do for that because you're going to have to make a few little adjustments. So here we are with Marigold. Now, if you want to skip the bound neckline and you want to add a knit band, we're going to have to just make a little bit of a modification to the neckline. Because it's a bound neckline as is, basically this ends up being almost the final width of the neckline because we're wrapping fabric around this. But with a knit band, you need to sew the knit band to it, which has a seam allowance, and then the knit band has a width. So we actually want to remove, I'm going to say about 3/8 of an inch from the neckline. So again, you're just going to come in using whatever tool you have at your disposal to remove that seam allowance. And we're literally just going to end up cutting this off. That's the only modification you need to make for a band. So this whole thing's gonna end up getting cut right off, okay? We've modified the neckline, and of course you're gonna make that modification to the back as well. We're gonna remove that 3/8 of an inch from the front and the back neckline. And then you need to cut out your neckband piece. So you can use the Marigold sweater binding pattern piece. You can basically use this as a reference for how long it needs to be. You just need to decide how wide you want the finished band to be. So I believe both Véronik and I, the finished width of this piece, I think was about 2 inches wide. So, or sorry, 2 inches high. So it's 2 inches high, then you folded it in half, you sew it to the dress with a 3/8 seam allowance. And then when everything gets pressed up, you have, I don't know, maybe 5/8 of an inch visible net band. But this can be the length. So you would basically want to just take this, use this as your reference and make it 2 inches high. And then you have your piece for your neckband. And I think maybe Amma will make sure in the YouTube video that we include a tutorial to how to install a t-shirt neckband, because it's a different construction technique than what we use for Marigold. So that's the only thing that your modification you're gonna need to make for this. In terms of this, if you wanna add ribbing here or some kind of band here, it really just depends. Like the width of that band, actually, I'm gonna put on the sweater so you can see, 1 sec. So here I am once again with the sweatshirt, getting a little sweaty for you. Now we need to, so we figured out the neckband, now we need to decide how big this piece is. So if you're gonna add like this kind of gathered cuff, you want this piece to have a really good recovery and have a good amount of stretch. So either something like a ribbing, or you could also take a look at like a really stretchy, maybe like a cotton span, something that's got a good amount of recovery, that if you're like pushing it up and wearing it all day, it's not gonna get all bagged out. And then you just need to decide how high you want it. So the final height of this is about 2.5 inches plus a seam allowance. So let's call it 3 inches times 2 because it's folded in half. So the height of this is gonna be about 6 inches, right? Then we're gonna fold it in half, we're gonna turn it into a band. In terms of how wide it is, it really just depends on whether or not your ribbing can match the length of the sleeve opening. So what you would wanna do, and I would kind of save it for this almost being completed before you go and cut that pattern piece out. Before you come and sew this side seam here, I would open up your sleeve flat so you know how long it is. I would take your ribbing, or I would take whatever piece of fabric that you're gonna use, and I would first kind of determine how tight you want it. So take that piece of fabric, kind of wrap it around your arm, and decide, okay, I think I would want it about this tight, right? Mark that with a pin or a piece of pencil. You kind of know how long now that should be. Take that piece of fabric and stretch it, and see if you can stretch it wide enough to match the length of the sleeve. And this is a really wide sleeve. Like if I measure this right now, let's see, it's 24, almost 24 inches long. So just think, you're gonna have to have a piece of fabric that's really stretchy if you're gonna stretch it and match that length. If you can't get it stretched that far, what you could do is still keep the size, the width of the band, but you can just add a little bit of a gathering stitch. So sew your sleeve together, sew that side seam here, go and add a little bit of a gathering stitch, so a long basting stitch, and gently gather it. And then when you go to sew your cuff on, so you're gonna take that cuff piece, you're gonna sew it together, so you have a tube, you're gonna fold it in half, so you have a cuff. I'm sorry, I wish I had an example to show you, but you can kind of imagine. And if you're gathering it, when you go to serge everything together, by gathering it, you'll be able to give yourself a little bit more room. Because I'll tell you, when I made this, I didn't do it as tight as I wanted to, because I knew that even as tight as I stretched that ribbing, I was gonna have a hard time sewing this. And then you have to think, if you're at your serger or you're at your machine, you're zigzagging, you have to keep that ribbing stretch as you're sewing everything together. It can be really tricky. So if it feels like it's just not gonna happen, then just add a gathering stitch to this. It'll be a little bit easier, and then you can remove the gathering stitches at the end, and then you'll be able to kind of gather this entire big wide sleeve into this narrow cuff. So hopefully that makes sense. Otherwise, if you want to skip that, you could certainly just keep the bound neckline and the bound finish that we call for here. We just did want to show you a way to do it that you could do it with ribbing if you really wanted to have that sweatshirt feel. So I hope you're feeling inspired to take Marigold and make some different garments out of it. For such a simple shape, I think you can get like a deceptive amount of looks out of it for, you know, maybe 5 or 10 minutes of work with a hip curve and a quilting ruler. And I think that's it for today. You can hear Coco barking. She's also done for the day. Thanks, everyone.